Welcome back everybody to our studies in Tsarist and Communist Russia. In this video we are going to be moving on to the second of our major monarchs in our conversation, moving away from Alexander II and looking instead at Alexander III. We will talk about his personality and outlook, and then we will think about his political policies, some of his political policies, before moving on to looking at his more social policies, the idea of Russification and the impact on Jews and Judaism. We're going to be talking about this part of the specification. The specification sort of mixes and melds Alexander II and Alexander III together. I don't really like that very much. I like to deal with it a little bit more chronologically. So I've sort of dealt with Alexander II more in the first sort of 2 or 3 videos, and now I'm talking about Alexander III specifically, just to separate the two. We'll talk about the attitudes to and opposition of autocracy and a number of key developments in this period as well, focusing specifically on government and czars, so talking about politics. As a basic introduction then, Alexander III, even before coming to the throne actually, the slide says coming to the throne, before coming to the throne, let's just think about Alexander III as as his appearance, his personality and his outlook. So in terms of his physical stature, Alexander III was a physically imposing, very tall, very broad individual. His appearance seemingly, therefore, symbolized his political ideals, the idea of strength, of authority, of unshakable control. And this sort of comes into his political beliefs. So he comes to the throne in 1881 following the assassination in March of his father Alexander II by the people's will. We'll get to that in a second. But his political beliefs are influenced by his reactionary teacher, Konstantin Podenstinov, the chief advisor and procurator of the Holy Synod. If I've mispronounced that name, I've butchered that name, then I apologise. It's a complicated name. It will not be the first, it will not be the last, pronunciation butchering that I do in these lessons. Ultimately, though, the reactionary tutor that gives Alexander III his political beliefs, therefore lead to the development of a strong belief in absolute autocracy, the idea that the Tsar should wield total and unquestioned power. His belief in orthodoxy, the Russian Orthodox Church should therefore play a very central role in reinforcing loyalty, and a belief in central belief in nationalism, the idea of unity and superiority of Russian culture over minorities. And we see that in his politics. So in terms of his political policies then, his reign is marked by a sharp departure from that of his father and the more liberal reforms of his father. After the assassination of Alexander II by the revolutionary group People's Will in 1881, in March 1881, Alexander III sought to restore autocratic rule, to suppress revolutionary movements, and embark on a policy of what could be described as reactionary conservatism, aimed at reinforcing the absolute power of the Tsar, and actually also dismantling many of the reforms that we see in the 1860s and the 1870s. Shortly after he ascends the throne, then, in 1881, he issues the Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy, which outlines his political vision. This includes the firm establishment of Alexander III's stance as being against constitutionalism, limiting civil liberties, and introducing a parliamentary system, i.e. Against introducing a parliamentary system, should I say, reaffirming then the autocratic power of the Tsar and rejecting any notion of government based on popular sovereignty or parliamentary representation. Under Alexander III, then, we can start to see a number of repressive measures. The role of an expansion of state police and secret police becomes even more pronounced. We see a move towards a police state where political freedoms are severely restricted. Alexander III was determined to prevent any further challenges to his authority by both liberals and revolutionaries. For example, the Okhrana, the secret police organization of the Russian Empire, became the most, or one of the most powerful tools of this policy of repression. It was responsible for infiltrating revolutionary groups, for suppressing dissent, and for conducting surveillance on suspected subversives. It would infiltrate universities and labour movements and political organisations. It would arrest and exile intellectuals and revolutionaries and anybody who posed a potential threat to the Tsarist regime. Informants within every sector of society would ensure that any dissent was quickly reported. We also see the growth of political trials. Public trials specifically became increasingly rare. Many people would then start to be tried in secret courts and exiled to Siberia without trial. People who were found guilty of revolutionary activity or anti-government speech often faced execution or forced labour or exile to Siberia. In terms of censorship, we see, firstly, press censorship being drastically expanded during the reign of Alexander III. The state exercised strict control over the content of newspapers, books, and journals. Newspapers were closely monitored to essentially prohibit any criticism of the Tsar. For example, writers like Leo Tolstoy faced censorship, and some of their works were banned or heavily edited by the government. Alexander III also worked to undermine the judicial reforms introduced by his father under his father's reign, which had initially allowed for greater independence of the judiciary, greater legal rights for individuals. So, for example, we see the Statute of State Security in 1881. This was a significant legal change, should I say, which limited the authority of the legal independence of the judiciary. And it consolidated the Tsar's authority. It gave the government broad powers to suspend civil liberties and to deal with political dissent. Furthermore, we see a reorganisation of the court system in a way to undermine the reforms of Alexander II, which previously had allowed for greater independence and for greater public trials. We see, for example, under his reign, judges were appointed directly by the Ministry of Justice, which ensured that they would be loyal to the Tsarist regime, and the jury system was also restricted. So political trials had previously been held without a jury, and now more trials would also be done without a jury as well, and now political trials were held in secret courts too. There was an expansion of the penal system under Alexander III. Political prisoners, including revolutionaries and just those who were critical of the Tsar, were sent to Siberia in exile. Alexander III also tightened restrictions on political groups, even the ones that advocated for reform in a non-violent manner. We see restrictions on free speech, firstly through the press and literature. Banning of books was often very common during this time. Tolstoy, Turgenev, and Dostoevsky were all at risk of banning or censorship of their books and their writings. Within academic settings, freedom of speech was severely limited. Universities became a target of government scrutiny, and any political activism by students was suppressed quite significantly. Political organisations were often banned or cracked down quite significantly as well. We see a cracking down on labour movements and student protests. Often these movements would be infiltrated by the Okhrana, as we noted in the previous slides. Ultimately then, in taking an introduction to the reign of Alexander III, we can see that clearly repressive measures are taking place, and we see the shift all the way back to what would be described as autocracy in the most purest of senses.